Welcome to Conversations from the Heart, honoring Andrew Cohen through our stories. My name is Daniela Bomater. I was a student of Andrew's for 17 years, and for the past 9 years, I had the privilege of living and working alongside him. This series is a tribute to his life, his teaching, and the evolutionary fire he sparked in so many of us. Through these intimate conversations, we remember not only the man, but the depths of transformation he catalyzed in our lives. May these stories keep his legacy alive, honoring the sacred thread that connects us and allowing his voice to continue resonating through ours. So welcome, Craig, to these
Thank
Conversations from the Heart. Very happy that you
be
agreed
here.
to do this. And it's the 10th conversation that I'm having with you. And yeah, it's an honor to have you here. And
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
these conversations, I didn't prepare them with questions. It's not an interview or anything. But what
Okay.
I did in the same way in every conversation is just ask the first question, which is an obvious one. How did you meet Andrew? And how did you end up staying with him for quite a while? So what happened there at that point in time?
Okay. Yeah, well, let's see. So I met Andrew when I was 26 years old. I was kind of had decided based on some early spiritual experiences I had. I had by that time decided to really devote my whole life to my spiritual path. And
Mm.
I was I had traveled some in Asia at that point and spent some time in monasteries and meditation retreats and things. But it was very interesting. I was in northern Thailand staying at a monastery doing meditation, and there was this, and I was on my way to go to India on this long kind of trip pilgrimage. And I had just finished university like a year before that. And I'm sitting in this, up meditating all night in this monastery, and it's thunder and lightning and storming out. And all of a sudden, in this middle of all this, I got this strong like communication that said, your teacher is not in the East. You're not going to find what you're looking for in the East.
Wow.
And so, I can't remember, or it was like, yeah, it wasn't that you're going to find him in America, but it was that you're not going to find him in India.
Not
And
here.
and it was so compelling to me that I kind of believed it, and I thought, well, I'm looking for, spiritual awakening, and if my India trip is not where it's going to happen, then I'm wasting my time. And I ended up changing my plans and going back to the U.S. And
Oh, really? Yep.
I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and I I came back and I was there and just working and living there and doing my spiritual practice. And I went into a spiritual bookstore one day and was thumbing through different spiritual books, New Renaissance Bookshop in Portland, Oregon. And I saw this book, Enlightenment is a Secret, on the shelf, and
Mm.
by Andrew.
Yep.
And I picked it up and I started thumbing through it and reading passages. And I had heard Andrew's name because when I was planning to go to India, I had asked another friend who had been to India, like, tell me about the spiritual scene. And he had mentioned, oh, there's this guy named Andrew Cohen who teaches sudden enlightenment and is doing retreats in Bodh a lot. So
Mm.
I had heard that only, his name, which maybe prompted me to pick up the book. But I picked up the book, read a few, stood there reading it for 10 minutes or so. And there was just such a directness to the message in the book. The direct awakening is available to all of us here and now. It is not something that needs to take our whole lifetime or many lifetimes.
Mhm.
And I could just feel this force coming through the words. And yet I had been much more oriented toward a much more gradual path that had lots of different, a kind of North Indian tradition that had a lot of different levels to it. And you had to progress
Yeah.
here and there and there and there. And so I was arguing with this book, and I put it back on the shelf and I left the store. And for about 2 days, I was just kind of arguing with Andrew in my mind. Like, how could it be so direct? What about karma? What about, different developmental levels, and had my, but it was so gripping me. I finally said, I'm going to go and buy the book. And I went back to the store and I bought his book. And I remember as I left the bookstore, I had this two experiences simultaneously. One was this experience of a huge weight being lifted off my shoulders. I just felt light. And at the
Mm.
same time, I felt another kind of pressure on the center of my chest, like something, the
Yeah,
challenge of
yeah,
where
yeah.
something was coming. And I went home and I had this book now, and I would just spend all my free time reading the book and meditating. And I was just getting this incredible transmission off the book, essentially,
Mm.
feeling it was just awakening something in me. And I was starting to just have this very profound spiritual opening just from reading this book over and over. So
Mhm.
after probably less than a week with just me with this book, I sent a letter. I think, yeah, this was long before email. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I sent an
exactly.
actual letter um, to the publisher address because there was no information in there to learn more
Yeah,
about Andrew Go Here or to find out about Andrew Go Here. There was nothing
yeah.
in this book back then. So it was just an address of a publisher. And I sent a letter to the address saying, I don't know, but I wrote it to Andrew and I said, I don't know if this will find you. I hope that letter gets to you. But I feel like you're my teacher. And, I've been reading your book and um, I want to awaken and I
Mhm,
want to
mhm.
meet you. And I didn't know where he was. I didn't know he had a community. I didn't know anything. There was no internet. You couldn't just look people up and find out about
What
them.
year was that? Do you remember what year that was? Just to locate it in time a little bit.
Yeah, it was around 92,
Yeah,
around
yeah,
1992 or 91. I can't remember. It was right around then.
yeah, around
Um,
that.
so yeah, I think it was spring of 91 maybe or 92. Anyway, so so I'm reading this book and oh yeah, so I wrote Andrew this note and then I get a letter back from one of his students, from Michelle Hemingway, and she said, "Oh, Andrew got your letter and was very happy to read it and wanted to let you know that he's going to be teaching in Seattle next weekend." And I
Mm,
was living in Portland, which is pretty close
yeah.
to Seattle, so I was like, "Oh, well, that's good. That's good timing, you know." and and he invites you to come and attend the teachings he's giving there, and in fact sent me some information to connect with people in Seattle who were hosting it, and maybe try to find accommodation and things like that. So yeah, and then promptly, now that I knew I had contact, I ordered all of his other books and I ordered a bunch of his tapes and I started like consuming all that before I met him. And
Mhm,
then
mhm,
was just feeling like I was in this field with the guru in a sense,
mhm, mhm.
before I even saw him. And then I remember driving up to Seattle to spend like 3 or 4 days where he was going to be teaching every night. And I had this powerful experience where I was just parking outside the satsang hall where he was going to be teaching, and it was like a few hours before the event. And I saw these two guys like carrying boxes and things into the hall. They were doing setup. And as soon as I saw them, I felt like a lightning bolt hit me and just almost
Oh,
knocked me out. I just
really?
was like,
Yeah.
wow, I just this powerful energy. And it turned out were close students of his who were there doing the setup. And and so then I proceeded that night, I sat down, I waited early, got in the front row, sat there, and
Yeah.
and I could just feel when he came out, just the force of enlightened consciousness in coming from him was so
Mm,
powerful, and I was feeling it so strongly that I just, it was totally overwhelming to my system. And so I stayed there the whole time and I asked him all my spiritual questions. I was one of those, like, every time he
yeah.
so
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
I had another thing to ask him. I was trying to really make sense of it all and I was really hooked in. And I didn't sleep for the whole 4 days I was there because every time I would lie down to sleep, I just felt like I was plugged into the wall. There was just
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
electric current running through my nervous system. And I was just felt like all my questions were being answered. And I was finally understanding all the spiritual books I had read in my own experience.
Mm,
just I remember leaving this kind of to drive back to Portland and just having this very distinct feeling that my whole world had changed, that everything I knew had changed, like I was in a completely altered state of consciousness. But I was also aware that I could lose it all in a second. It
You
was
were
like
aware of that, yeah?
I was
That's
aware. I was
amazing.
aware,
Yeah,
like I'm in this, but even like as I would interact with people in the world, I could feel how I was interacting from a different world
yeah,
to the ordinary world, and the ordinary world could pull me back into it
yeah,
just
yeah.
like that. So I felt like I had to protect it. Like I have to protect what's opening up. And I promptly made all these massive life decisions. I quit my job. I ended a relationship that I had gotten into. It was fairly new relationship, so it wasn't a long-term thing, but I just kind of decided I was going to change everything and made plans to go and follow him around Europe for the summer where he was going to be leaving for in a month and teaching all over Europe
Yeah, yeah.
and I just pulled the plug on my whole life essentially and went off to follow him around. And anyway, so that's how I met him.
Wow, that's an amazing story. As they all are. I mean, I think I have heard so many stories, and it's each and every one is kind of mind-blowing. He had such a transmission when you connected to him. When
Yeah, and of course that's an interesting transmission, such an interesting thing in itself, you know, having been on the path so long now and
yeah,
been also teaching for so long, you know,
yeah,
so there's something there's something kind of subjective about transmission or specific, meaning I've gone to see certain spiritual teachers and felt zero transmission from
yeah,
them and thought, oh, they don't have any awakening. They're just speaking from their mind. I don't feel any higher consciousness. And then I had another person tell me, "Oh, I went to that teacher and they have such a powerful transmission."
yeah,
And
yeah,
I was like, "Wow, I didn't sense anything, you know." And I know some people would go to Andrew in those early years and feel like, "Oh, I don't get this guy at all. I don't resonate with him at all. I don't feel anything at all." And meanwhile, I walked in there and was just lit up, you know,
along the way.
lit up like 100,000 watts.
Yeah,
So,
and I think that's something that happened during the 39 years Andrew was teaching, that it literally split the audience into the ones that felt fully connected and felt
huh,
his vision, and the other ones that more or less walked away saying, yeah, no, this guy is not the real thing.
yeah,
He
I
I
don't get
always
it.
felt like he really, it was quite black and white. the,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
I love him or I don't like him at all
Hmm.
thing.
Interesting.
Not even connected to the crash or anything, just how people reacted to him.
Yeah. But yeah, he elicited strong responses
Yes,
for sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
way or the other.
Yeah.
So, and
So
then you traveled with him, and
yeah, I spent the summer. Yeah, we went. He was in like London for I don't know, a few weeks, and then we were in Amsterdam for a few weeks, and then we were in Switzerland, where you are,
yes,
in Bern. He was teaching for a while, and
yeah,
we just kind of bounced around, and by the end of the summer, I was just, because I think for me, what that summer represented was an opportunity to get to know his students and his community.
hmm,
Because, if you're an ardent young seeker looking for your
yeah, yeah,
teacher and community, you want to feel like it's happening for the students too, not just like,
yeah,
oh, I have some powerful figure, but everyone around him is like, just in devotion mind or something.
yeah,
And he
yeah.
had, and I was so impressed with the people around him. I was so impressed with the student body. I made friends with them over the summer and I just had so much respect for them. They all seemed to be really, because Andrew, on the one hand, from early on, was very much about this radical awakening here and
Mhm.
now. But, fairly early in his teaching, he also started to really tune into this the need for our awakening to manifest in our
Yes,
actions and the need to like be an exemplary human being and to have extraordinary character. And so he was pushing on all of those things, which was kind of unusual at that time in the kind of history of East meets
Yeah.
West spirituality. There, because there at that time there were all these teachers of non-duality are running around doing satsangs and kind of neo-Advaita Vedanta, and they weren't talking much about that. They were just saying, just
It's
awakening,
all a
take care
dream.
of
It's
it.
all a dream, and you have to
Yeah,
wake up
the
from.
world doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
actions and behavior won't even change when you awaken. You'll just have a different, you know,
Yes.
outlook on things, and that was a kind of popular teaching, around that time. And so Andrew, just for whatever reason, what he was tapping into, I would argue it was just a deeper, more authentic, more whole, more complete kind of thread of awakening, that then he was really calling for that. So I felt that in the students. I thought, wow, these are people who are really striving to walk their talk, to
Yeah.
live the teachings, to be exemplary human beings, which just intuitively made sense to me. I never could understand those other teachings that were so divorced from how we live our
Yeah.
lives. It had always seemed to me that the only awakening that could matter would be one that would transform us as a human being, and we would be like a model human being, be somebody who others would learn from and look up to and be inspired by. So yeah, so by the end of that summer, I felt like, wow, well, I have a lot to learn from Andrew, and I have a lot to learn from these people.
Yeah.
And I I asked Andrew if I could come and join the community that he had in Marin
In
County,
Marine. Yeah.
California at that time, where people were living in kind of communal houses all over Marin and meeting for gatherings at the Mill Valley Community Church or the Cord Madera Yoga Center, and Andrew was giving teachings there, but there were also just a lot of community activities happening and group meditations and different kinds of gatherings to talk about the teachings. And so he said, okay. And so the end of that summer, I moved to Marin and got deeply involved in his community and just loved it. I mean, I just felt so at home. I felt like I had found my tribe, my people. I was
Hmm.
just so inspired to just meet all these people who were so wholehearted about their spiritual path and willing to give themselves to something difficult, because Andrew was not an easy teacher. He was not a soft teacher. He didn't have, I mean, a lot of that we could say maybe to a fault, and I think he learned that in the end, maybe. But he was very exacting, very demanding, and
Yeah.
so anybody who was willing to go and live there and apply themselves to it was somebody who was willing to kind of have their feet put to the fire and be challenged and challenged again and again to evolve, to awaken, to become aware of our impact on each other, and to really cultivate a deeper spiritual conscience. So yeah, so I dove in.
How would you describe how his radical nature translated into the guru student relationship? How would you describe it? Like how did you experience it as a student? What was it? What made him so sincere, but also so radical and so demanding? I would say, no.
That's a great question. It's very interesting because he was, where it came from was, it was that, just give me a second to think about how to
Mm-hmm.
articulate it. See, he became aware early on, and I probably through his own experience, but then definitely through his initial experiences of teaching and working with people. He became aware that there was this choice everyone was making. And and I don't mean everyone, but I mean that he became aware that once a person has had an awakening to, let's just say,
Mm-hmm.
their true self
Mm.
beyond the mind and ego, once a person has had an awakening to that, they like, he kind of had this acute awareness that, well, from that moment on, they're always kind of choosing whether to align with that and be true to
Yeah.
that, or whether to just give in to the momentum of their conditioned self and ego structure with all of its defenses and
Yeah.
distortions. And and you know, there's like, this is kind of one of these it's true and not true kind of things. But he was really aware of this thing about choice, and he was really, and it was like he, so when he would, when someone would have an awakening around him and he would see, oh, this person gets it, they're seeing it, he would feel like, oh, they're meeting me, we're together, we're one
Yeah.
self now.
Yeah.
They're awakening to the same self that I'm awake to, and we're one, we're together in this one higher consciousness now. And then, and he would feel like, okay, so now this is like how it will be. This
Yeah.
person will
Exactly.
stay here, and
Mhm.
and we'll now meet here and progress from
And
here,
we can move forward together. Yeah.
from this awakened self. And then he would see that same person the next day, forget it,
Yeah.
and or you know, and from his point of view, turn away from it,
Yeah.
because he had this radical kind of acute insight that, like, well, once you've seen it, you could always access it, and it's a choice if you don't, and you're just
Yeah.
giving into the weaker, lower parts of yourself. And he even saw it as a kind of moral imperative to stay awake. And he
Yes.
would feel like, well, once you've seen the truth of who you are and of how reality is, you're morally obligated to stay true to it, to stay
Yeah.
awake, to stay aligned with it, to do whatever you need to do. And if you don't, you're actually betraying yourself, and you're like betraying God, and you're
Yeah.
betraying the guru. You're betraying Andrew because he revealed it to you. So, and this is where things, you know, again, started to get tricky, because he, on the one hand, there's like, you can see the purity of that view, that absolute stance, and he would, you know, look at everyone through that lens, and therefore he would expect everyone to meet him in their highest potential. And when they didn't, he would be very unhappy with
Yeah.
you. And and so there was a kind of pressure in being in relationship with him to stay true to this deeper thing. And so, see, here's the where I'm saying it's tricky, because when it worked, it was beautiful, and
Mhm.
it was powerful, and you couldn't imagine anything more direct than what I just described, right? It's, life is binary. You're
Yeah.
either awake or asleep,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
you've shown that you can be awake, and I'm awake, and I'm going to hold you to it. Let's go. And then, you know, you're going to fumble around and struggle with your insecurities, and I'm going to hold you to not go there and stay true to this. But, you know, not everyone could do it, and not everyone could do
Mhm.
it very consistently. And so it's like, when it worked, it was this powerful, like, um, tight, you know, rope, you know, cord between you and the teacher, between, you know, between me and Andrew, and he would be like pulling on me, and I'd be pulling, you know, and we'd, you know, be moving together. But when
Yeah.
it, you know, when it didn't work, people would really tend to fragment and kind of fall apart, because the pressure was so great. And, you know, what we know about human development now is that, you know, it, people are at all different places on the path. People have all different kinds of capacities to live in that radical of a way right now. And that
Yeah.
just having an awakening doesn't give you all the tools and capacities you need to stay awake. And that even though there's a purity and a truth to the view that there's always a choice, and it's a, and I encourage people to lean into that, because it's the most, it's the most empowering stance you can take,
Yeah.
even to yourself, to say, oh, what do I want? To boil it all down to, what do I want? And am I willing to give up whatever's in the way? And am I willing to do whatever's required to stay awake to my true self? Like, that is a beautiful, empowering relationship to yourself and to your path and to your life, if you can handle it.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
you know, there's this, I always have liked this quote from Brian Swim, where he tells the story of the hawk and the mouse, and how the mouse wishes the hawk would slow down and lose its eyesight, so that the mouse wouldn't have to run so hard and hide and be so good at hiding and running. But that if that happened, the mouse would gradually lose its capacity and become weak and frail, and lose
Yeah.
all of its, you know, agility and strength. And always ends that story saying, we should wish each other as much stress as we can creatively assimilate. I wish you as much stress and pressure as you can creatively assimilate, because that's going to keep you on your evolving edge.
Mhm.
But how much stress and pressure can anyone creatively assimilate? And if we flip too far in one direction and say, well, the person, I can't handle very much, I'm delicate, I'm weak, I'm wounded, I really need to be, I can only handle a little bit. Well, which part of the self is that? That's kind of the weakest part. That's the most conditioned part. On the other hand, if you've got somebody saying, do it all right, you need to be able to meet it right now, or you're a failure,
Yeah,
then
yeah,
that's gonna, for a lot of people, they're gonna just collapse and fragment into those weaker parts of the self, which happened a lot around Andrew. He had a lot of people falling by the wayside over the years who just couldn't meet that
yeah,
intensity, and didn't have, and it wasn't all just, I mean, he was very black and white about it, but it wasn't that he was like, you're either doing it today or I'm kicking you out. It wasn't that intense. It wasn't that extreme, but there was because it was a kind of moral, he saw it as a moral imperative. There was a kind of moral stance. Then it was like, there was just so much shame, I think, that people would feel when they couldn't meet the demand he was placing on them, that they would then collapse into that shame body, really, that
yeah, yeah.
part of the self. And didn't have and Andrew would try to create structures and support for people, but I think in a fairly limited way. Like, I don't think I heard from him, in much later years after the community fell apart, and he went through a hard time, that he started to realize he should have been uh, more respectful of people's different developmental
Yeah.
capacities, and much more made more room for people to struggle, and not hold them through in such a moral kind of lens, and not push so relentlessly on people who were already struggling. Like, I know later in life, he had more started to reflect on some of those maybe oversimplified lenses that he had early on, that again were
He,
drawn
he,
from his own radical experience. And again, he had students who could meet it. And so then he would say, well, look at so and so, they're meeting it, and they're
yeah, yeah.
able to do it, and they can do it, everyone can do it. And that was kind of a mistake, because if you like look at some of the other traditions that have that really worked intensively with non-dual awakenings and authentic awakening over centuries, and really studied how it played out in different human beings, like Vajrayana Buddhism probably is the most elaborated kind of enlightenment system that we have. And they will break down all the different types of students very
Mm.
clearly, and say there are certain type of student who can understand the awakened view the first time they hear it, and they can, they can, practice from that point forward. And but that's a very small percentage of students. And then they'll say, and then there's another type of student who can, after a certain amount of practice, has
Yeah,
receptivity
yeah.
and can open to the view, and then they can, but they'll have like all these different levels of student, and they identify them, and then and they say there's different remedies and different practices for these students. And it's not just like, so I think, Andrew didn't have the
But Craig,
benefit of a tradition.
I wanna ask you
Yeah,
something,
go ahead,
because
jump
I
in.
also feel that's all true, and I know that Andrew did see in the last years that he didn't make these distinctions, and that he didn't really see what was possible for the different students. He was
Mhm.
very aware of that. But I want to get to another point. Wouldn't you say that most students of Andrew's came to him because his radical nature was so attractive?
Well, it's very interesting if you go around. It's so, you know, I just to kind of put my answer in context. So I was with Andrew 13 years. I was super close to Andrew. We worked together on our magazine. I often spent like 8 hours a day with him, working on the magazine, talking about other students, helping think about how to guide the community. We were very close.
Yeah.
And I was someone for whom always felt the teachings really worked. I never
Mm-hmm.
felt like they didn't work for me. I felt like
Yeah.
I was able to really apply myself. All the pressure he put on me, I was ultimately able to meet and grow in response to it. So I was able to creatively assimilate the incredible stress he would put me under.
Mm-hmm.
So I was one of those people, but I left because I became incredibly frustrated with what I felt was him relating to every, the old, when you the only tool you have is a hammer, you see every problem as a nail. I felt I would see, Andrew, not everyone's not the same. People aren't going to respond to just being put under more pressure. People are being hurt, and there are ways you could teach them and help them. And he wouldn't listen, and we had a real, you know fall eventually had to split because I just
Yeah.
felt like he is not receptive to feedback around how he's teaching. He was receptive to a lot of feedback, and we should talk a little bit about my whole role with him at the magazine, because I got to see a side of him that a lot of people never did. But because he had a lot of receptivity, but around how he was teaching, he would always just, nope, it's this way or that way. So anyway,
Yeah.
so I left. I'm just creating context. So I left there, what is now about 20 years ago. Yeah, 20 years ago I left. And 10 years later, the whole community
Yeah.
disbanded and fell apart because some of his students put pressure on him, and he, wouldn't let them give him feedback, essentially, and it all collapsed. But so what's been interesting for me, just even in the last few years, is a few opportunities I've had to interact with people who were at various stages with Andrew in his community, and what's been interesting to me is to kind of get a sense of how many different types of experiences people had. See, because I always
Mm-hmm.
kind of thought, because I was in sort of I don't know, for lack of a better word, a kind of elite group in the community
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
kind of advanced students who really were able to apply the teachings and also worked closely with him and could handle even that, because even that was quite challenging to be close to him personally, right? You had to kind of meet him or it wouldn't work. So I was in this group, and I think I had assumed a lot of uniformity about why people came, what their experience was, kind of like Andrew did. Andrew would have said what you said. Yeah, everybody came to me because they could sense the radical nature and they felt they were ready for it. But when you really talk to people, you go, no, some people came because they just felt this incredible heart connection to Andrew. And because his transmission was so powerful, there were a lot of people who just felt opened up to this current
Mm-hmm.
of love. And
Mm-hmm.
they just felt, oh, I'm just feeling the love of the universe. I'm feeling the love of God, and I want to be close to it. And
Mm-hmm.
other people said they felt it in the community. They could feel, I want to be part of this community of people who are so open and sincere. So my experience of talking to more and more people is people came kind of for different reasons. Not everybody really understood the radical nature of it. And again, because people had, I think, a lot of different capacities, because people are all different. and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um so I think that's true for some. I mean, certainly to some degree everybody could feel the radical call, but like, to understand the implications of that and what it would
Yeah,
really
that was not even
require.
possible, no? I mean,
Yeah,
you couldn't really
yeah.
know what you get
So
into
you
when you
feel,
kind of,
oh wow, this is radical, this is great, but you have no idea maybe how much
no,
it's
you
going to
don't.
demand from you, and
I
how
know. Yeah.
much you're really going to have to let go of, and
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
going to have to change.
Yeah.
So
And when you think you have let go of almost everything, he still sees something that is not let go of, and pushes you on that place. Yeah.
yeah, so are you
Yeah.
willing to just sort of stay in the fire, which, we should, guru or no guru, if we want to live an authentic life, all of us want to find a way to stay on our own edge,
Yeah.
to keep seeing whatever's next, whatever blind spot is there and maybe wasn't there before but crept in over time, or what. We have to always
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
humble, always listening, learning, seeing where we're making mistakes,
Yeah.
growing. And Andrew was just someone who really held that for people and forced that and pushed that and created a community that did that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just him, it was all of us co-creating this powerful field of kind of calling everyone to rise up.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to share with you something that I find interesting because you described so beautiful the black and whiteness of true self versus ego. Yeah,
Hmm.
like, and I know that before the crash, he taught that ego and authentic self or true self never meet. They are kind of two parallel tracks.
Parallel
They never
streams.
meet. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but this for me is the most significant change in the last year since he taught again.
Mm,
He taught that aspect significantly differently, especially in the last 5 years, by encouraging his students to develop a really stable, positive ego.
mm,
And he described the authentic self much more as a state, which makes a lot of sense, a
mm,
state of awakening that wants to fall onto a beautifully developed positive ego.
mm.
So,
What did he mean by positive ego in that sense? Because the way he had
uh,
previously
uh,
defined ego was more as a pathology,
yes,
you
and
know?
therefore I'm bringing it up
Yeah.
because in his last years he split the ego in negative ego and positive ego. And the negative ego was everything that had to do with I feel victimized, poor me, arrogant me, everything that, yeah, that contracts us in
Mm,
ourselves. Whereas positive ego, he encouraged his students to develop a positive self-esteem and also a belief in our own worthiness for enlightenment, like in the most positive sense. And that would all sit in the positive ego, like like spirit to develop spiritual self-confidence so that the awakening actually can
mm,
fall on a beautifully developed individual that then
mhm.
can shine into the world and actually be of service to the world. Yeah. And
Well,
I felt
yeah.
that that was
Mm.
a really great change and improvement of his teaching.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that kind of through a traditional lens, it kind of matches how, like I was saying, the kind of deeper Enlightenment traditions related to it. Like they would, again, I was mentioning Tibetan Buddhism for a moment, but to typically in those traditions to be even get access to the higher Dharma teachings, you have to do all this purification of the
Yeah,
self
yeah,
because it's sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
believed that we don't want people who are full of all that ego
yeah,
pathology
yeah,
and kind of gross tendencies. We don't want them getting the power of enlightenment because it'll be distorted
yeah,
by the container, and so we need to purify the vessel so it's ready to to hold this light, and so that you know
yeah, yeah,
but and it's just interesting for Andrew, because he would, I mean, here's the thing, he always kind of taught that what you're saying in a way, but he didn't call it positive ego. He just felt like we needed to cultivate our character, our best self, our higher
yes, that's true. He
capacities. I mean,
did that. Yeah, yeah,
he wanted everybody. He a huge part of his teaching was on self purification. I mean, like the Tibetans, he had his students doing hundreds of thousands of prostrations and
hmm,
purification practices to try to help people reduce their arrogance or
yeah,
reduce their kind of unworthiness or whatever those ego structures that were in their way
yeah,
were.
yeah,
So I think, yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, I'll have to think about his way of dividing the ego and all that. I don't know how
yeah,
but anyway, they're all just concepts. But
exactly. But
fundamentally, the idea of having a, and why is that important? Because we can look back over the last several decades of awakening coming to the West and see countless examples of people who had powerful awakenings that just empowered ego
yeah,
pathologies,
yeah,
and they became teachers who made big messes with their communities, including Andrew. And that's the great irony of Andrew, I have to say, that I find so, when he passed away, I was reflecting, all of us went through our own process around that. But one of my really sad things, which I shared with my close friend Carter Phipps, who was my best friend and closest
hmm,
colleague there, and when we were in Andrew's community way back when. But I was saying to him that, like, I still feel very, there's like a pain in the fact that, see, from very early on, Andrew saw how kind of corrupted the Dharma teachings had become in the West. And he was really a stand for wanting something different to happen. And he wrote all these articles early on. And in fact, What is Enlightenment magazine, which I worked on for 8 years, was kind of launched to try to directly go into these topics that had to do with like purity and spiritual teachers. And he was saying, look, there are all these teachers on one hand who are kind of selling enlightenment short and saying, oh, enlightenment's not that big of a deal. You're still just the same old schmuck you've always been, but now you have some enlightenment. He really railed against that idea. He also pointed to all the teachers who had had sexual scandals that had wrecked their communities and said, this is just, they weren't upholding the truth that they had realized, and they were abusing their power. And, and he had a big article called Corruption, Purity, and Enlightenment in one of those first couple issues of the magazine, where he just went into all this. And this was such a preoccupation for him. And I think part of what drew me to him, I was saying to Carter, was that I felt that way too. I felt like, oh, here's a teacher who is a stand for the purity of the teaching role and the radical nature of enlightenment, and who is, trying to blaze a path of authentic awakening in this Western world where so much has been diluted, watered down, lost, over psychologized. The Dharma's been so over psychologized that it's just like another healing modality to do spiritual practice, as opposed to this radical awakening to a different part of us and a different possibility for humanity. So Andrew was such a stand for all that. And then in the end, his legacy was that he ended up in terms of how history's going to hold it, he ended up in the column of, another kind of failed experiment where the guru was corrupt, where, and I like to kind of say to people, well, the thing about, it's all true, because in the end, Andrew wouldn't, my one analysis I would bring to it is just that I felt, and I always felt it when back when I was with him too, as I was like, Andrew doesn't want to be part of the community because he could feel how if he sort of like joined the meetings as another guy, even among his leadership circle, even among those of us who were leaders, if he just like got into a context with us where we could give him feedback and challenge him, that it would just, the hierarchy, the power of the awakened hierarchy would be lost, and he couldn't bring himself to do it, had no impulse to do it. But then I would see, but on the, and he wouldn't do it. Sorry, I think I'm putting the cart before the horse. What I'm trying to say is Andrew didn't have any context of peers who would be able to give him any feedback, to help him reflect on things. He had a peer circle among his senior students, and he had certain friends who were other spiritual teachers that he talked to, and and other kind of luminaries. But he didn't talk to him about this. Like I knew all of his relationships with all the other teachers because I was in the middle of them. I would be in those rooms and I would hear about his talks with all of them, and I knew what was going on. And it was never like, wow, here's what I'm struggling with as a teacher. Wow, here's, where I feel challenged. And he never set anyone up in a position where they could challenge him. They could give him criticism. They could give him feedback. So he ended up in an ivory tower kind of bubble until the whole community kind of matured to a place where he was getting in the way of a lot of things practically, and they tried to like now give him feedback about it, and he just wouldn't take it. But it was, I'm sure he regretted it in the end, because it was like, it just seemed too all at once probably, or something, or he just, I don't know. I can't psychoanalyze him. I wasn't around that last decade, so I don't know. People say things had gotten a lot worse, but anyway, it's just very sad to me that, because he had such a desire to be an example, to leave a legacy of like purity and integrity in the spiritual scene, and most people see him as like the opposite now. And I feel it's complicated, and I just knew both
Yeah.
parts of him. I knew both parts. I knew the part of him that wouldn't listen when he should have. I knew it well because I was with him every day, and I'd be like, Andrew, you know, we had shouting matches, and I knew that, but I also knew the part of him that
But
was
he
actually
also did
super pure.
listen. I mean,
Sorry,
I
what?
also know the Andrew that did listen because,
Yeah,
and that's also why it is complex. I got to know him as not always being sure what to do, and then actually wanting to have your opinion and wanting to listen and wanting to hear. Not about his teaching style. I agree with that
that's
one.
what I'm saying. See, but
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
everything else, he really
It,
was. No,
yeah, yeah.
I worked with
He
him
was
on the
not
magazine. Yeah, go ahead. You
that.
said
Yeah, he was not an autocrat. That because
no,
sometimes he is
he wasn't.
painted as the guy that sat on the
Right.
top and commanded everything, but that was not what was happening. In many ways,
It's true.
he did also delegate and give people power to run uh, certain parts of the business, and he did listen, but as a teacher, he felt that he was the holder of the pure dharma, and he didn't want to play with that. He didn't want to get any to take anything from anybody when it
Right.
came to the pure dharma, no?
Even in those later years after everything had fallen apart. See, that's interesting because yeah, like working with him on the magazine all those years, and people didn't know this about him, I think, who weren't close, but you know, we would we would argue everything out, and he really
Mhm.
wanted us to argue with him. He
Yeah.
really wanted everybody to say their opinion, and he didn't hold it against you if you
Mm.
won the argument or what, like there was a kind of purity to him. And one example I will give when I'm trying to describe it to people is, so how most human beings, when they have a strong opinion about something that they're really advocating for,
Yeah.
that then if someone else brings something up that counteracts it and proves them wrong, like they really,
Yeah.
oh, wow, I'm wrong. They lose face over it. They have a hard time kind of pivoting to the new
Yeah. Yeah.
position. They still, well, I saw it this way because of this. But that's the ego trying to defend
Yeah.
itself, right? So
Yeah.
with Andrew, it would be amazing because he would advocate for a point of view so hard. Say, we should do call the issue of the magazine. We should give it this title, and he'd be so excited, and he'd be having somebody create an artistic rendering of it, and he'd be going and going, and then a couple of us, we meet with him and we say, we don't think it's a good idea at all,
Yeah.
and here's why, and we think it should be more like this, and here's
Yeah.
why. And
And he took it, no?
he'd go, oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Exactly.
There was
Exactly.
no ego. There was
Yeah.
no defense. He would just go, oh yeah, you guys are totally right. And then
Yeah.
like, okay, let's do that. He had an ability to let go of his point of view
Yeah.
and move to a more accurate point of view without any internal ego kerfuffle.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Which
that's
was
very
very
true.
rare,
Yeah.
very rare in my experience that people can do that.
But you had to come with good arguments, and that is what I loved in
Well,
the
and
interaction
stand
with
in your
Andrew.
own
Yeah,
strength.
you
Yeah.
really had to. You have to had solid arguments in a good way, not in a bad way. It just he wanted you to be clear about, yeah, okay, why is it not a good idea? Why should we do it differently? Should we do that? Like you had to be very clear.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you know, I it's interesting. I really loved Andrew. I really, leaving that community was the hardest thing I ever did in my entire life. I left him. I left all my friends. I left my career, my job at the magazine, all at
Yeah.
once. And and I always hoped that gradually things he would come around, and like the whole thing would mature, and he would come to a place where he could start to be more open to people's different points of view and feedback, and like that he would I kind of always hoped that someday he would change. And then when it all fell apart, I was just like, I felt terrible when it fell apart because even though I had left and gone on and I was teaching myself out in the world, and I felt very aligned with Andrew still in a lot of ways, even though we had our huge differences. I felt aligned with his teachings fundamentally, and I
Yeah.
felt like he had brought a clarity with his teachings that was very unique and that
Yeah.
it was really important. And so I always felt like, well, the community's still going. That's good. It's probably maturing. Andrew's probably maturing and change. And then when Carter told me about his big talk with Andrew that then brought the whole thing crashing down, and and I was just like, wow, it didn't it didn't ultimately work out, but just because it didn't ultimately work out doesn't mean that Andrew's legacy isn't spectacular still. And I guess
Yeah. Yeah.
for this interview I would just want to highlight, because I that community shaped so many incredible people who are out doing great work in the world, and even people who aren't doing, like, visible, aren't public figures doing anything, visible. People who lived through that experiment and really were shaped by those teachings get recognized by others in their fields, in their companies, their relationships. The qualities they have get recognized as something very unique.
Yeah.
And I remember it happening to me after I left right away. I'd go and, like, I was just looking for work, for a little while before I started doing my own teaching work. And, people would hire me to do some project for them, and just be like, wow, who are you?
Yeah.
You've got so much,
Yeah. Yeah. You have
mental
something going.
agility and flexibility and inner strength
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
all these qualities. And I heard this over and over from people, and I see it in so many people.
Yeah.
Um, Now, who just are able to function at a really high level in whatever they're doing in the world. So, there's a bit of a narrative about how Andrew, just hurt a lot of people and left a lot of people wounded. But I feel like it seems like most of the people I've encountered, even who maybe went through a period of being really traumatized and messed up
Mm.
by
Mm.
all of it, kind of seem to have emerged out the other side carrying a lot of the strength and positive
Mm.
qualities,
Mm.
and to see it all in a more balanced light than they did for a while. I mean,
Yeah.
you're interviewing people, and probably seeing a lot of this eye to eye. I know everyone's in a
No,
different
no,
place
I
and
think you
has,
are right. And
yeah,
in one way or the other, even if people themselves can you not yet witness it really, but
mm,
they have benefited from the time and from I would say most of them, probably not all of them, but most of
yeah,
them.
seems like most. And
But
and to those who can't, I want to say I get it. I also understand that some people were really really pretty ravaged by Andrew's intensity and didn't feel loved and contained and supported in
mhm.
that, and ended up feeling pretty hurt and may still feel fundamentally hurt by it, really regret having been part of it.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that's a valid, people went through a lot of different experiences there. Some people had a, like, largely positive experience, like myself. Other people had a pretty horrible experience, and
yeah,
had a hard time leaving and just felt really, weakened and demoralized, and that pain is real, and that's part of Andrew's legacy too.
yeah,
And he, my hope is that in his having been released from the physical body now, that maybe he's has a kind of lucidity about it all, and that's enabling him to step back into his full kind of
yeah,
awakened power, but also to somehow, maybe, I don't know how it all works, but maybe support
yeah.
people's healing from the other side in some way. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, what were you were going to say?
Yeah, no, I wanted to cover one topic with you, and I see that the hour is already
I'm okay.
approaching.
I can go for a
You're
while.
okay?
It's okay.
Okay,
It's okay.
very good.
I can.
So, because I wanted to ask you about 30th July and the intersubjective work that you did with Andrew, because you were there at
Yeah.
that breakthrough time, yeah. So I would love to hear it from your experience, your point of
Oh,
view,
yeah.
what happened there and how significant was it?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So Andrew would say that pretty early on in his teaching career, when people started to gather around him, um, and he was teaching night after night, and then people were just sort of spending time together all day, and they were talking about the teachings, and they were just being together, and then they'd be in the teachings again at night. He started to notice some quality happening between the people
Yeah.
that was different from just individual enlightenment. It
Yeah.
was like, oh, there's some collective awakening phenomenon that happens between people sometime where there's this beautiful higher consciousness that's being shared. And he, I think that became for him at a certain point, like he saw that as the goal
Yeah.
ultimately. He saw that as like, oh, enlightenment's not just for individuals to be liberated. Enlightenment's for a new way of, for human being is to bring about a
Come
new way
together.
for human beings to come together and live
Yeah.
together beyond ego from these higher consciousness places. And so he started formally getting people to meet together in groups to try to make more of this happen. And that was pretty early on, because even when I first joined the community way back, we were put into peer groups where we would meet, and there were kind of two types of meetings. There were meetings where we would talk about ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
talk about, well, here's what I'm struggling with on the path, and we would give each other support and try to help each other with that. And those were delicate, and often we would have like parental supervision, meaning somebody who was more advanced
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
come in to help, because you get everybody giving each other feedback. It can be a little rough. Um, but there were those groups, but then there were these other ones where we would just talk about the teachings and not talk about ourselves, and just be
Mm-hmm.
trying to really talk, trying to speak from these awakened perspectives, essentially. And for me, I remember the first time this thing happened. It was when I was living in Marin, and I was in. He had often had the groups divided by gender, so I was in a men's group of fairly junior, newer men in the community, not his like long-term students, because it was my first year there. Um, but I remember we were talking, and one person in the room like said something that had a whole different frequency to it than
Mm.
what everyone else was saying. And a few of us picked up on it. And then we like started speaking from that same place. And there were suddenly three of us in the group who were all resonating at this higher
Mm-hmm.
consciousness. And and then we were trying to figure out how to get everyone else to see it and join it,
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
was very clear, like, oh, there's this higher consciousness that we're all now in one mind, the few of us, and we're trying to get other people to join, and a few were able to, but not everybody could, not in that moment, and what happened in those kind of events is, if you couldn't connect with that higher frequency, pretty quickly you felt like performance anxiety and
Yeah.
struggling,
Yeah.
and would contract more, because, oh no, this thing's taking off and I'm not on it,
Yeah.
this plane's taking off and I didn't make it through the door. So that happened. But I remember our group had this experience, and it was so profound, and it continued from meeting to meeting where we could come together, and we just wanted to stay in it and talk in it all the time. And Andrew heard about what was happening in our little group, and he wanted to meet with us, because he was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
there, it's that thing, it's happening,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
so because he wouldn't normally meet with these newer people, directly, but he wanted to meet, so he met with us, and we described it to him, and he was like, yeah, this is it, you guys are tapping into it. But of course, he didn't know how to make it happen. I mean, this was often the thing. He knew what it was. He could recognize it. He wanted it to happen, but he couldn't really guide it, because he hadn't been in it himself. He was like above it in his awakened state, but he wasn't down in this. How did this thing spontaneously emerge in a group? He wasn't even there. So I don't know. I'm sure he gave us some guidance. I don't remember it helping. I think it probably made us all feel performative, like we had to somehow do it again, and it fizzled out after a while and didn't continue. And then I think he was probably mad that it didn't continue because we had betrayed it or whatever. That was kind of his frame. But anyway, so that was my first experience of that. And then and then over the years of us being together, this thing would happen in groups occasionally. And some, one time it happened for a group of women on a retreat in Europe. And they
Yeah.
all suddenly came together in this. And Andrew was like, oh my God, look what's happening with the women. And, this thing happened and they described it and it was exactly what had happened for us. So, yeah, so the July 30th event that Andrew, you know, made a lot out of was a group of us had he had this was following a period of immense pressure that he had been putting on the men, our group of men, and this is where we had moved into our large property in Western Massachusetts, where we had our live-in ashram, essentially, or monastery. And he had been putting immense pressure on the group of men to like rise up as a whole
Mhm.
and like bring everyone with us and really go somewhere. And it had been a very tough period for, I don't remember, a year or so. And that had kind of culminated in a very long, extended retreat that a bunch of us were on, where we were just in retreat, meditating day and night. And he, and then after we had been on retreat for a while, he wanted us to to start meeting and talking. And not all the men were on the retreat. Some
Mhm.
weren't, some were. Most of us were. Um, but we started having meetings where we would again talk about the teachings, higher, talk about the authentic self, talk about and not talk about ourselves, but just talk about the experience of that. And there was one meeting in particular where this phenomenon started to happen where, a higher consciousness frequency was being spoken by a few people, and then effectively everybody in that room was able to
Mhm.
get into the higher consciousness together. So there was this one consciousness experience, and there was this incredible energy soaring in the room, and we all kind of ascended together into this
Mhm.
place that was just beautiful and like completely devoid of the personal ego, and everybody was able to leave their ego behind essentially and go into this together. And when we described it to Andrew, I think he felt like, oh, this is it, because everybody got because it happened for everybody, as opposed to like
Yeah.
usually it would be some people but not everybody. And then we kept meeting for several days, and continuing to meditate and do our practice, and this carried on for some period of time, and it started to affect other people and other groups that weren't part of that. Even like overseas, we
Mhm.
heard that some of the groups that were meeting at that time started to like have this experience. So there was this kind of ripple of collective awakened consciousness that was happening through his whole student body and was becoming kind of contagious.
Mhm.
And yet the thing is, I think again, it wasn't something that could be really stabilized, because it, like, this came out of an intense long retreat that we were all on while it happened. So everybody had, created a lot of distance between them and their ego, because
Yeah. Yeah.
everyone was in
Exactly.
deep meditation, and like these higher states would occur. But then Andrew would just get so frustrated because he'd feel like, well, once you've been there, why can't you just stay there? You're just not, you don't care enough about it. People don't care enough, or they would just do what it takes to get there. And for me, it was sort of like, well, that was probably true for a certain percentage of the group that could hold it, because they had the
Mhm.
development that developed the capacities to hold these higher states. But for a lot of people, they were able to just ride along with it
Yeah. Yeah.
because they just made a leap in a moment because it was so powerful in the room. It's sort of like transmission, teacher has the transmission, people are receptive, they can feel it, they can go into awakened consciousness just because of the teacher's field. This was like group co-transmission, but the expectation that now, because everyone had tasted it, they now had what they needed to hold it and manifest it, was kind of radically unrealistic and out of touch
Yeah.
with the developmental complexities, which was, Andrew's Achilles heel, really, which is so interesting because he was so into higher development. He was a preacher of development. He was an integral, loved integral theory, but somehow he couldn't see enlightenment as developmental, or the capacity to hold enlightenment as developmental. He kept trying to see it as this binary moral, choice point. Anyway, so that, yeah, so anyway, it didn't really ultimately last per se, but it did create a new bar and a new reference point for, I think, the whole community, in a sense, that elevated, everything, I think, probably from that point on.
Yeah, and I do personally think it did create a groove in
A
consciousness.
groove, yeah, sure, a
Yeah,
place
so
that's
that
there.
it's
Yeah.
my own experience is that it's probably more accessible today
Mm,
than it was when it happened the first times, or when it can. It's almost like, yeah, opening up a space that is now available for people who are serious and put the intention on meeting in that space.
it might be,
Yeah.
might be.
And I'm personally also quite disillusioned that even for EnlightenNext, it didn't help anybody to then meet the challenges around the crash time and actually
Mm,
stay beyond the ego and solve the problems that were obviously there. And
mm,
so that
mm,
is something I grapple a lot with. What does
mm.
it all mean when we cannot use it to solve actual problems, no, between people and among people? And
Well, I think we can if we stay aligned with it and stay true to it. I think probably what happened there at the end was because I've interviewed a lot of friends and former friends, informally, but really probed like what happened at the end and why did it all fall apart, because this was one of my questions for people when it, was like, okay, I get that there was this big confrontation with Andrew and he wasn't willing to like receive the
mm,
challenge and the feedback, and I get that, but why didn't the community hold together anyway
yeah,
and say, well,
exactly.
we're gonna demand something from Andrew and we're gonna stay together and carry on. Like I said, why didn't that happen? Because I wasn't there, but it seemed ideally. I think that's what I'm hearing from you. Like, why weren't people able to hold the
Yeah.
course and just let this Andrew thing
And
work itself
actually
out
implement all the changes that some people seem to
that
have
wanted
said.
to make
So
happen?
that
But
was always my question. Why, when Andrew then
yeah,
stepped down and went into his sabbatical, why
mm,
didn't they take the opportunity and actually make the changes that were uh, needed in the structure
yeah.
of the strong hierarchy and in the whole organization?
Well, the answer I've been given by everybody who was in kind of in charge at the time when that all happened was just that there had been so much pent up frustration on an individual level
Yeah.
that that nobody had the will or the motivation to carry the thing forward at that point. They were just kind of like I think he had spent all of his relational collateral with a lot of these people, and they were just ready to move on, and not everybody, but there wasn't enough of a center of gravity that wanted to hold center and move forward. It was just like all the individuals had reached their enough point with him, and it felt
Yeah.
like I'm not gonna die on another sword here, because of course, you know
Yeah.
people were mad. Anyway, I don't know, I wasn't there. I've heard some things, but that's what I've heard from some of the people who
Yeah, me too.
I've asked that too.
That's the
It was
story
just like
that,
they were fed up, they were done, and they just, that was it. So
yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure you
But
have other people who can comment more meaningfully on that because they
no, no,
were there.
I mean, I have heard exactly the same explanations, and it never completely satisfied me. Let's put it like this. In my
Well,
own utopian vision, I always felt like, yeah, but guys, why didn't you just? But anyway, it is
well,
what
you
it
can you can hold to your utopian vision and you can make it all happen now. It's never too late.
is. Yeah. But one last question, Craig, just to
Mm.
end on a positive note. What
Yeah.
is your most beautiful memory of your interaction with Andrew, or
Oh,
your being together
wow.
with Andrew, or your time with Andrew?
Gosh, I'm sure I won't be able to come up with the most one right all on a second, but I'm sure I can come up with pretty good ones.
Hmm.
Um, You know, the experience I had working with Andrew on the magazine, which was such a big part of our life together, because this was the nexus of his spiritual inquiry, you know, where he was in his own learning and exploring, and it was, you know, for me and for those of us on it, it was like our whole life mission to bring
Mhm.
this inquiry out into the world. That we just had endless hours of just beautiful time with him where he was, you know, just his open, playful, because Andrew was incredibly playful, you
Mhm.
know, and he was just his open-hearted, playful self, and we would just be exploring ideas and reading books together and discussing them and chiseling the magazine, and then, you know, I think when we would like finally bring it all together in the end and have an issue formed, and we'd all just be on cloud nine together and just
Yeah,
being
yeah.
in his like the joy, you know, his joy and his open heart and his, you know, real appreciation for the hard work
Mhm.
we were doing. You know, there was just yeah, I the Andrew I will remember and hold most is was that Andrew who was just such a fun, such a great friend, and so caring and so loving and so wholehearted and so open and innocent in his inquiry, and you know, just and all at the same time always calling me to my highest, and
Yeah,
not, you know, not settling for less than my best, and just like like we want a really good mentor to be, you know, just he was just all
yeah,
of those things in those moments. So there's a
yeah. That's beautiful.
positive
And
note.
and I even would say, even if he didn't call us to our best, we wanted to be our best. No, like that was just it,
Mm,
being in his presence and working with him. That's
mm,
was at least my
mm,
experience.
mm.
Also meant like you want to be your best.
Yeah.
It was not always that he had to push, or
No,
it
that's
was
true.
just,
Right.
yeah,
Compelled
it,
it.
it,
Yeah.
it was the call to grow and the call to be your best self for the sake of the whole.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
So thank you, Craig.
well,
I think that
thanks
was
for doing
great.
these.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for doing
much.
these. Yeah. Happy to
Yeah.
happy to be here and share and reflect. And I'm glad you're doing it. I was hoping there would be some kind of memorial service where people would share, but then I thought, well, this is a a more eternal memorial service because you're putting
Yes.
it all up. So it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.